Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today we have Paul Bui, and Paul is from Fronius. Hey Paul, what's going on?
Hey Sean, thanks for having me here, part of the podcast. I'm honored and I'm excited to be here to ultimately talk about the solar industry and hopefully talk about some few fun things.
Yeah, I know. Fronius, it's just like a fun name of a company. It just sounds like kind of a cool name. I remember one time I was talking to somebody and they were like, we were at this conference and then we ran into Mr. and Mrs. Fronius. Do you know Mr. and Mrs. Fronius?
So I have met them a few times through my employment at Fronius. Genuine people, honest, down to earth, genuine people. And I like that you mentioned that Fronius is an interesting name because it really is that someone's name that has been passed down through the generations.
Yeah, and I know also that Fronius is famous for welding machines. Like I even heard that they were in the Tesla factory or something like that. So, I mean, since you're sort of competing against Tesla, you shouldn't let them use your inverters. Just kidding. And then another thing is I have this idea. So, you ready for my idea?
Yeah.
Since you do welding and you can have direct PV arc welding where you get it all set up and then you wait for the sun to come out and you start making this big arc and then you can weld stuff and you won't have any like efficiency losses for anything in between the sun, the wire, and the arc.
A direct feed from the sun to melt whatever metals and weld whatever you need, huh?
Yeah, so like a direct PV system is a PV system like where you just have the sun, a PV module, and a pump or a fan, or in this case, an arc. That's even cutting out more middlemen. It's just like going right straight to plasma. And it's kind of cool that the sun is plasma, the arc is plasma. So you're just going like from plasma to some, crystal electron flow right back to plasma.
I love that idea. And honestly, I would even say it ties closely with how Fronius came to be in a contemporary sense and what we've turned into. Originally, as you mentioned, Fronius is a big welder. We have been in this industry, the power electronics industry, for in January, it will be 80 years. So we have
Yeah, 1945, right?
exact.
Yeah, because I was just looking at the website and it said that you guys have been around since 45. So that's before Bell Labs came out with the solar cell.
Yep. And so our solar division actually came to be around the 1980s when at one point the owner, Fronius Günther, thought to himself that we were quote unquote energy thieves, always taking energy in order to weld. And
Uh-huh.
so part of our goal of being sustainable, we took our knowledge, expertise in welding, and ultimately turned it back into a solar inverter so that we can no longer be energy thieves.
So do you have customers that are buying both the solar and the welders?
Yes. So nationally, we do have people who are mainly interested. A lot of times the interest comes into our welding, mainly because our welding technology is far into the future and utilized at many different levels of robotics as well. But once people get into it, they hear about our solar side a little bit, and that generally opens doors to being able to offer both solar and welding to these end users.
So I'm wondering, is Fronius more of a welding company or a solar company?
We consider ourselves less of both and more about power electronics.
So you're a power electronics company. Like, do you sell more money's worth of welders or inverters?
I would say welding team has a pretty solid, not to say our solar is lacking, but the welding has many years of technological advances. So I would say our welding size is a larger portion than our solar energy side.
So there's different types of welding, and I know like a lot of people think that welding is like, you're using some kind of gas and you're making some real super hot flame. But there's also arc welding. Is Fronius more into arc welding?
So, part of my experience, I actually get very minimal chance to work with the welders or a welding team. So, I'm not too sure. I know probably the most famous of the welders is our CMT machine, our cold metal transfer. And that one pretty much marked a new age of welding for the industry, mainly because Fronius spent upwards of 10 years developing welding technology to weld aluminum to steel. So our CMT is probably our most fascinating, but the Trans Arc was the first welder that we came out with. And so we came out with quite a few different after.
So you said cold metal
Transfer, CMT.
CMT, like certified massage therapist, also probably not much
Yeah.
of a difference. So this the cold metal transfer puts aluminum to steel, and so I figure it must be using electricity and not like argon gas or something like that.
Yeah, somewhere
Huh.
along those realms. If I had a welding expert next to me, I'd be able to answer all your questions on that.
Uh-huh. Okay. Those I've been around some welders and they're crazy. So be thankful you don't have to hang out with those crazy people.
It's cool technology, though.
Uh-huh. Yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, super cool. And so you got the solar, you got the welders, and let's talk a little bit more about the solar. So everybody in solar these days is doing energy storage, and so I'm sure Fronius is doing energy storage.
Yep. So just a few months ago, we had officially brought the Fronius Gen 24 to the US market. And this marks our first ever hybrid inverter that we are introducing to the US market.
Cool. And so about the kinds of inverters that Fronius has, what's like your smallest and your largest inverter?
Yep. So the smallest inverter that we offer is a 3.8 kilowatt single phase residential Gen 24, and it comes in two models starting November 18th. We will be offering it also in the Gen 24 Plus version. So originally, the inverter is actually developed to be a solely grid tied inverter. So the version that we actually offer to the market right now is a grid tied. However, come November 18th, we will be releasing a software update that allows people to make the transition from a grid-tied inverter to a hybrid capable inverter. And
Okay,
take
so let's even talk about that inverter a little bit. So it's a 3.8 kilowatt inverter, so that's 3,800 watts. And if we take watts divided by volts, we get amps. So we divide that by 240 volts for residential, and then we are going to get just about 16 amps. And the way that you size a breaker is 16 amps times 1.25 gives us a 20 amp breaker. It's actually going to be slightly less, and then you round up to 20 amps. And a lot of people love putting inverters on a 20 amp breaker because there's this thing in the National Electrical Code in 705.12 where we're talking about load side connections. And our favorite load side connection is what we oftentimes call the 120% rule. And oftentimes, if you have somebody that has a 100 amp bus bar, 100 amp main breaker, you take the bus bar times 1.2 is 120 amps, subtract off the main breaker, and that leaves you 20 amps for that 20 amp breaker as long as you put it at the opposite end of the bus bar from the main breaker. And so that's why 3.8 kilowatt inverters are so popular and so famous. And do you also have a 7.6 kilowatt inverter?
We actually have a 7.7, so we went up a little bit larger. We did offer, which we actually still do offer, the Primo 7.6. It was really good mention how you mentioned that because the 3.8 and some of the sizing of the inverters, what the industry doesn't know is that they were sized to fit those types of applications where you have 100 amp. And when you add additional size, the 7.6 also fell into the similar realm. So we did upgrade it now. The Gen 24 is no longer a 7.6 like our Primal, but a 7.7.
So, as far as being a 7.7 with the math, it kind of makes it so you're slightly larger than a 40 amp breaker. And I imagine that you're probably making it so it works with a 40 amp breaker. So, when you're talking about voltage, you've got 240 volts. And they call that nominal voltage. So maybe sometimes it's a little bit lower and a little bit higher. So when it's a little bit higher, a little bit over 240, maybe you have it. So that's when it's putting out 7.7. Is that? I think we'll be like very close. So let's see. If I did the exact math and I took 16 amps times 240 volts, I get 3,840 watts. And so if it was 3,850 watts, so it's only 20 watts difference is what we're talking about there. If we're
Mhm.
talking about the 40 amp breaker, you would be like 20 watts over. So do you limit the current a little bit? I remember that a long time ago, there used to be this inverter. They called it a 4 kilowatt CL for current limited inverter.
Mhm.
And is that what you guys are doing? Because I imagine, can you put it on a 40 amp breaker? at 240
You,
volts?
you should be, yes, you should be able to put it onto a 40 amp breaker with no problems at all. But as for your question regarding its current limiting, I'm not too sure if it's current limiting.
Well, it must if you could put it on a 40 amp breaker, it's doing something like that.
Yeah.
Because if you did the math with 7.7, you would be just slightly over. But I bet you if you look on the data sheet for that inverter, it probably says 32 amps. I bet you that's probably what it says there.
Should be very close to it, Sean. The rated AC output of the 7.7 kilowatt inverter is 32 at 240.
Yep, so it's exactly 32 amps at 240. So they've limited the current to 32 amps so it works out because I couldn't imagine going over by that small of an amount. But anyway, so that's your smallest inverter. And what is the rapid shutdown solution you're using for that? That's probably mostly used for residential. As far as like we were talking about, the first one we talked about was the 3.8 kilowatt, right? And then the 7.7 kilowatt. So what are you using for rapid shutdown for these inverters?
Great question. So for the Gen 24, with our previous experience with our commercial line inverters, actually, so this stems from our commercial line inverters of the SIMO Advanced series. The rapid shutdown of choice for that device was the AP Smart RSD S PLCs.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So that product worked fantastically with the SIMO Advanced series of PLCs, and we wanted to carry that on over to our Gen 24. So what you'll see is that we have compatibility with both AP Smart's RSD-S PLCs as well as the RSD-Ds.
Okay, so you guys are using the AP Smart for rapid shutdown for those particular inverters. Yeah, I remember when rapid shutdown first came out, and a guy called me up and he said, "Hey, come talk to us." And I did like a tiny bit of consulting, and they're like, "What do we do? It's got to do all this module level shutdown stuff." And I was like, "Well, maybe you should have been there at the meeting when they were deciding all that stuff, and there's not much that I can do." And it's
Mhm.
kind of funny. His name is Brett Young. I know he hasn't been there for a while. And did you ever know Brett or hear about him?
That name sounds really familiar. I may have met him before. I may have met.
But what's funny is just by random coincidence, he lives right down the street from me in a house that my uncle used to live in, decades and decades ago, like when I was a little kid.
What a small world.
Yeah, and I see him at the gym once in a while. So he's a super nice guy, but he was working at Fronius and had me come over there and do some, try to do a little bit of consulting and stuff like that. So then what about your biggest inverter? What's the biggest Fronius inverter? What voltage do you go up to on the DC side?
So as of right now, the largest sized inverter that Fronius has to offer to the American market is going to be our SIMO Advance. It is a 24 kilowatt inverter featured in 480 volts.
Great. So you're going up to 480. It's 24 kilowatts. So Fronius is pretty much specializing in rooftop solar or ground mounted solar that offsetting building loads, probably not utility scale.
Yep, most definitely. So around the 500 kilowatt range and ground mounts work really well with our inverters and string inverters.
Mm-hmm. And is there any plans to go big and do utility scale?
That's a very good question. We see through our experience after actually the release of the Gen 24, we had many questions regarding this. As much as the market likes the Gen 24, it seems there's a big emphasis on the commercial market within the US. And so it is an opportunity for us to come out with one. Something to note is that if you take a look at our international offerings, we do offer, I believe, 100 kilowatt size inverters and larger. So we do have slightly larger inverters outside of the US.
Oh, so you do bigger, so it's 24 kilowatts in the US, and then you're going up to 100 outside.
Yep, I believe we call it Argino, which looks like 125. We also have the Verto. This one might be slightly larger than that of the Simo. Looks like it goes up to a 33 kilowatt. But previously in the US, we did offer one larger inverter size that I myself had some experience working out in the field on, and we offered something called the Fronius CL. And the CL stood for our commercial line, but that was a 277 480 volt Y connecting inverter, and it was featured in a 33 kilowatt to a 66 kilowatt. Because it was an older inverter, it was also a high frequency transformer inverter. So you can imagine at that size, the machine itself was the size of a refrigerator, a full size
Uh-huh.
refrigerator, before
Yeah.
transformerless inverters became a thing.
Yeah, I remember my first contact or time I installed a Fronius inverter. It was in 2008, and we were a company, we were doing a lot of SMA inverters, and it was like we did some string sizing, and it was just like this small system wasn't going to work because the strings couldn't go short enough. And then Fronius had this high frequency inverter, and we could do a shorter string on it. And that's when we installed it. And so it was like a high frequency transformer. And so we
Yep.
had, back then we called inverters like transformer inverters, and it was really rare to see a transformerless inverter. And so it was this lighter inverter with a high frequency transformer. So I guess it like took the frequency, went super high, and then dropped it back down for the grid. And then another thing I remember too is like some years later, the guy that I was working with, I was no longer working at that place. He's like, "Hey, I got a call and this inverter is not working right now." And he's like, "What do I do?" And I was like, "Screwdriver, cell phone, stand in front of the inverter, call him." And he called Fronius, and he said they were great. And they just had him do a couple things and sent him a new inverter, and he just replaced it. So that
Yeah.
was pretty cool. And I guess it's probably still working. I don't know.
Yeah,
Uh,
you can also imagine something else you can imagine from Fronius is that we still more than likely offer the parts for that installer to continue repairing that inverter, keep it running for an unknown amount of time. So I've been with Fronius myself for 11 years.
wow, that's quite a while. Yeah.
Yeah, originally I was hired into the technical support team when I was 18 and worked there for 3 years, but I enjoyed working with people. I
Hmm.
enjoyed educating. Before Fronius, while I was in high school, I was part of a mentorship program, actually teaching young students from fifth and sixth grade about electronics and physics.
Uh-huh.
And ultimately, I ended up being hired at Fronius because one of my mentors at the time was actively looking for jobs for his students. And the resume was actually, the job was posted to our top student at the time, but he declined the position and it was put into my lap. And I thoroughly learned to enjoy working for Fronius through the years. And it's partly challenging for me to look elsewhere, mainly because of who Fronius is and what they really built themselves on. Something to note is that 4Ps, Fronius revolves around people, product, policy, and profits.
How about Persimmons? They're pretty good too.
I love persimmons. When they're in season, they are a fruit that I feel like more people need to enjoy.
Yeah. So you should throw in another P there next time. Yep.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
exactly. And they put a large emphasis on really people. And so what you'll see across the board with anyone who's worked at Fronius is that many of them have really good things to say about Fronius. When I was hired in, my mentor at the time, it was, you might have heard this gentleman's name, Emmett Muckles.
Oh yeah, I know Emmett. Yeah. In fact, I remember when I was teaching a class for some nonprofit in Detroit, that's when I met him. And it was like this global exchange thing with this thing called Green Economy Leadership Training. And it was
Yep.
like this dangerous neighborhood in Detroit where you could just listen quietly and they hear the houses collapsing. And it's called Highland Park. It was like a neighborhood or by Detroit.
Mhm.
And yeah, and Emmett showed up, and that's when I met him. And so I've known him ever since.
He's still a prominent key within the industry, and
Yeah, I always see him at all the different conferences. And yeah,
exactly.
cool.
We're really good buds, and he pretty much taught me my teaching skills. So, part of my duties here at Fronius, I actually conduct trainings all the time on our products. I've had a few classes on HeatSpring as well as NABCEP.
Yeah, that's really cool too. Because this morning I Googled you and it was like your bio was on HeatSpring. And then I had a meeting with Brian Hayden, the founder of HeatSpring. And he was like, "Oh, yeah, we did something with Fronius so
Yeah.
cool."
So it was really through Emmett and everything that he was able to teach me that I was able to improve in my communication skills and really changing the way that I taught about solar. So
Yeah, and I know Emmett has a podcast too, but I don't think it really focuses on solar or renewable energy or anything like that. I don't think he's been doing it lately too, but
yeah.
I'll have to double check. But yeah, really super cool guy. So let's see. Some other things is like the Fronius inverters. I remember I've seen them have really cool advertisements and stuff. And it was like, it seems like it's in Europe, I guess. Like there's like people out in the grassy fields and they're beautiful people, you know. And so what country is it, like Scandinavia or
Austria. So,
Austria?
international Austrian company with, I believe, 26 subsidiaries worldwide. And our headquarters is, we have a few facilities, Pettenbach, Thalheim.
Those are places in Austria.
Yep.
Yeah, I've been there. It's been a while, but I'm trying to think the last time I was in Austria, I might have been a teenager
Yeah.
doing the Europe trip when I think I was 19 in Innsbruck. Yeah, I remember I stayed at a hostel in Innsbruck. And so is the manufacturing happening there too?
Yep. So all of our inverters are currently being manufactured within Austria. Many of the parts.
Wait a second. Hold on, hold on. Is Austria a part of China? No, I'm kidding.
Good
No,
question.
no.
So there is a large influence within the international market of solar that comes from China. So it actually opened up a lot of partnerships for us, and this is a perfect segue into the battery compatibility and choice for
Great.
Fronius Gen 24s.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Great.
Yeah. So through our international partnerships, we were able to link up with BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams, and work with them on gaining battery compatibility with one of their batteries called the HVM. They do have a whole series on the HV series, HVS, HVM, and then HVL. For Fronius specifically, our Gen 24s work directly with the HVM.
So do you go and get the UL 9540 test with that battery? Is that how you're making it happen?
So, to my knowledge, yes, that is correct. Our international counterparts did the testing already, along with BYD to gain
Hmm.
certification.
Okay. And is there other batteries that you're working with?
So, we are capable of tying up to Franklin WH, their A gates. So, they are more or less an agnostic system. And so, that is another compatibility that we are actively working on.
Yeah, and it's like hooking up to them is one thing, and then spending all the money and time to go through the UL 9540 test is another.
Yeah, exactly. Processes like that do take time. So,
Okay, great. And so does it have the UL 9540 with a Franklin yet, or is it something you're working on?
I believe that one is relatively new news for us, and so that is something that could and that is currently being worked on. But we don't suspect there to be any problems in terms of compatibility on that level.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, making it work, that's one thing. And then going through all the tests, that's another thing.
Yeah.
And then there's also the UL 9540A, which is not like a test that you pass or fail. It's called large scale fire testing, even though if it's a small battery, they still call it large scale fire testing. And then that will help determine how close together you can put the batteries and things like that. So if you didn't go through the UL 9540A, then you would have to keep your batteries 3 feet apart, for instance. So anyway, BYD, are they the biggest battery company in the world right now?
For batteries, they might be. I do know that a majority of their business is within automotives and transportation, and they build a lot of infrastructure dedicated towards the automotive industry and EV charging. So outside of the US, I believe they are, if not the largest.
Okay, you know what? I just looked it up and it looks like CATL, cattle, is a little bit bigger than BYD, but that was last year, so things change a little bit. But cool. Let's see, this list 2023, so it's a little bit outdated, but they have just the top companies CATL, BYD, LG, Panasonic, and so on and so forth. So when Fronius started in 1945, what do you remember of that time?
Well, I wasn't born that time, but what I do
Oh,
remember.
sorry. I hope I didn't make you feel bad because thinking that you were like 90 years old. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Uh,
So 1945, a Romanian refugee left his country and ended up at I believe, a hotel in Austria. And essentially, what had occurred was that the owner of this hotel offered Gunther Fronius a place to stay if Gutner was able to repair his radio systems and some electronics around the building. And so that partnership eventually grew up into the family-owned company now. But initially, Fronius started as a battery charging company in 1945, really finding a way to charge the batteries back then. Most people were just throwing away the batteries when there was no charge left to them. And so there was a large need to find a way to reduce that waste and give a second life to these batteries. And Fronius Gutner was one of the first pioneers to create a battery charging system
Do
to
you
give
mean,
them.
oh, do you mean I could recharge batteries? I've been getting a new EV every week. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm going to try to figure out how to do that. We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show.
So regarding UL 1741 SA, I believe the 2008 and the 2013 changes, the addendums for the S.
Yeah, and so anyway, what these things are is like different places like California, they'll have different requirements. So there's greater and greater penetration of inverters on the grid. They have to do things. So, say for instance, they don't all shut off at the same time. And so as we do more with this, then we just keep going up and up. And in fact, there's even the emerging UL 1741 SC and things like that.
Yeah, these utilities are asking more and more out of advanced grid features from the inverters to really deal with a slew of different scenarios. But essentially, the SIMO Advanced series is SA compliant, I want to say. And then when we actually go towards our Gen 24 series, they are going to be both SA and SB compliant.
Great, great.
Yep. So our previous generation is lacking in that area. Something to note is that we do not imagine chasing those changes either regarding the Simo Advanced series or the Primo series. So you won't be able to see an SA or SB version of those. However, for our Gen 24, that is not a requirement that we should have to worry about.
Great, great. And so some other things too is maybe about non-exporting. So let's say that you are in a place where you don't get good credit for sending back to the grid. You don't get one for one net metering. So how does your system work with that?
So our Fronius inverters have the ability for dynamic power reduction. With the use of one of our monitoring cards and our smart meter, you're actually able to control the output of your list of inverters. You can have one or a group of them. However, as long as you have both the smart meter and one monitoring card available, then the one single monitoring card will be able to control the output of each of these inverters.
So maybe you could explain what that looks like with the monitoring card and the smart meter. So you have an inverter and you can stick things in the inverter and you put CTs, those are those little hoops, call them a current transformer, that measure current on AC wires. How does that look?
Yep. So moving towards our Gen 24, it's going to look a little different because every Gen 24 does come already with the monitoring available to it. So that's not something you have to purchase additionally. But when you take a look at our older products, our Snap Inverter series, specifically the SIMO, you do have to get a Data Manager 2.0 installed. So it would be an addition to it, but that's specifically for the commercial
So
side.
is that like when you say a card, that's something that you stick into the inverter?
Yep, a physical card, plug and play. So there is going to be a dedicated slot within the inverter that allows you to just plug that card right into it.
Sort of like how you have a SIM card in your phone. And then like the new modern ones, you don't even have to put a card in it.
Yep, no need for a card
Mm-hmm.
into it. The most that you have to do is going to be adding a smart meter. So it is a separate device that is offered. It looks very similar to if you've heard of Continental Control Systems, they offer a few different smart meters, but one of them specifically that they offer is a Fronius branded one and with Fronius software to it. And so that one is dedicated for use with our inverters. That, along with some CTs, as you mentioned, rated at 0.33 millivolts. Basically, you would install the smart meter by your AC panel, run your CTs onto your load side, and have your consumption data monitoring and being fed back into the inverter to be displayed on a monitoring website.
Okay, and so you get this separate meter. How do you connect that to the inverter, the smart meter?
Yep, the smart meter will have its own dedicated slots. We have a on each of the inverters and monitoring cards. So each of the monitoring cards, if you may will, they will have some Modbus inputs.
So the smart meter is something that you stick into the inverter?
In this case, it's actually going to be a separate small little box.
A little box that you put on the wall or something.
Yep, you can
Mhm.
install on the wall.
Does it have a display on it, like an electric meter, where it tells you how many kilowatt hours and things like that?
Nope, no display to it. So just a few diagrams on it denoting where to wire your connections and for what type of application. The smart meter itself can be utilized in a three-phase or a single-phase application. So you do have to wire it appropriately for both applications.
So you would wire this smart meter. There's a connection to the inverter. And do the CTs go to the smart meter?
The CTs do go to the smart meter. There will be another dedicated terminal connections for the CTs themselves.
And so you have these little CTs that are little hoops that measure current, sort of like a current clamp meter, and they go around some of your AC wires. And then you can program it so it does not backfeed the grid when you don't want it to.
Exactly. And you can also set it to a negative backfeed to fully ensure that there is absolutely no power that's being fed into the utility as well.
So, like a little bit of a room for error, I guess you could say. And then you coordinate that with the battery inverter, like with your hybrid inverter.
Yep. So the Gen 24, once you actually add those sort of connections, the smart meter as well as to the Gen 24, you'll actually have access to a bunch of programmable field adjustable trip points that deal with the functionalities itself. So you'll be able to change the state of charge for your batteries and a plethora of different trip points.
So, how does all the communications work? So, you have like Bluetooth, Wi Fi, wired, cellular.
Yep. So our monitoring card is capable of, well, out of the box, it speaks Wi-Fi.
And so, when you say monitoring card too on your new inverters, it's not even a card, it's built into it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, those speak Wi Fi. Okay. So, does the customer have to have Wi Fi or is it like its own hotspot?
So the customer does, if you want monitoring, you're going to need a source of internet connection at the site. We do have a cellular option that can be tied to our monitoring platform. And so that way you can send information through a cellular device, but an internet connection is going to be required on site to view any of it. However, for the setup of the inverter, you'd use your phone. And at that point, you can actually set up the inverter if you chose to not have it monitored, not have any sort of consumption data. You can have the inverter start up and commissioned without Wi-Fi on site.
Mm-hmm. Great, great. And so the cellular aspect of it, how does that work? Do you have a SIM card that you have to buy separately? Is it a separate like card?
Great question. So it is going to be a separate device offered by Digi that gets tied. So on the monitoring cards as well as the inverters, what you'll find is that there is an RJ45 or an Ethernet plug for a LAN connection. And so when you purchase the cellular device that's offered by Digi, you would essentially just plug into that LAN port on the inverter itself. The Digi device is a cellular modem.
Okay, so it's like a modem and it has like a Cat5 cable that plugs into where it says LAN, local area network.
You got
Right.
it.
Okay. All right. So we're getting all this stuff all figured out. And then with your inverter, so the ones that work with batteries, and so when people call it a hybrid inverter, when you can plug PV and batteries into it, are those the Gen 24s?
Yes. the Gen 24 specific.
So Gen 24, and is that because it's 2024, or is it going to be 25 next year, or is it just?
I would say so. It was destined to come out this year and take the market by storm and really set a new precedent for Fronius and the products to follow. Again, I mentioned that this is the first time we're stepping into the hybrid realm of things. But if you actually take a look at our international team, they've been in this realm for about 5 years and a little bit more than that now with hybrid capabilities. And so they have a lot more products that utilize the hybrid capabilities, such as EV chargers and hot water heaters that tie up to the Gen 24.
Wow, so you got the EV charger there. So we're pretty much talking about an energy management system, or you could call it a power control system. So energy management system, EMS, power control systems, PCS, and we can read about that in the National Electrical Code in 705.13. And when you're doing that kind of stuff with an EMS or a PCS, you can also avoid the rules that we were talking about before, like the 120% rule, because you could just limit current, which is very handy when somebody has a 100 amp service and they're trying to charge a car. And so do you have a EV charger that comes with the inverter, or you can buy it that works with the inverter, I guess?
So right now for the US market, we don't, but we are actively working on one for our market. We have good news regarding it thus far, and I'm excited to see more news come out about it. But as of right now, the US market is lacking in those areas of additional products to make full use of the hybrid. Something I do want to take a moment to talk about is why are we coming out with these products? Really, like ultimately, what is Fronius's goal with diving into these different markets? But something I'd like to share is our goal in developing products is towards our ultimate dream of 24 hours of sun.
Yeah, I see that when I'm in space.
Yeah. Yes. If you can make use of all the energy that sun is creating from space, why not, right?
Just got to get away from Earth. It just makes this big shadow all the time, or half the time.
Yeah, that is true. And so what you'll see is that in order to really continuously head towards our dream of 24 hours of sun, we're actively coming out with products that will be tied into our Gen 24 that makes full use of all the sun's energy. We're excited about it.
And so I imagine you're probably having plans for vehicle to grid and things like that.
We have some big plans. I don't want to speculate or share anything that, might not come to fruition, but we have a dream, and I think everyone with working at Fronius is set on the same dream.
Great. And then you've probably heard of virtual power plants, the
Yes, visual.
VPPs.
Yep. So we've been exploring VPPs for, I would say, like they came into our industry and the talk of it started to really arise about 3 years ago or so.
Yeah, and well, since Fronius is from Europe, that's where they were sort of invented, I guess. Virtual power plants. And so you coordinate together all kinds of batteries all over the neighborhoods. And what if you had 10,000 10 kilowatt hour batteries? And then you get something substantial. If it could be controlled all together as a unit, it's like the swarm method. Instead of having one big energy storage plant, you've got a swarm of them, which actually can work better in a lot of ways, especially when it's going to start working with the vehicle to grid. But we're just pretty much here talking about future things. It's not, it's a future thing.
Yeah, we love the future.
Yep. It's like we're there.
I'm excited for what it has to offer. Tomorrow will be another crazy day for us, huh?
Yep. Yep. Okay, Paul. So how are you going to single-handedly stop climate change, sea level rise, all that kind of stuff?
You're gonna drop a loaded question on me? Well, I'm gonna stop it with the help of like-minded individuals such as yourself.
All right,
I,
we're doing it. Yep.
yeah,
One of the things that I've thought about too is like you can break numbers down into small fractions and 10 to the 25th or 10 to the negative 25th. And so you could get it down hard enough to where you could say that like 1 kilowatt hour that you didn't make with fossil fuels prevents the sea level from rising something like 10 to the negative 25th meters or something like that. So it is possible. So every step is important, even though there are lots of small steps. It just takes a whole bunch of small ones.
exactly.
So do your part in keeping sea level from rising 10 to the negative 25th meters today. That's what we want everybody out there to do. So that all that means is just saving a kilowatt hour from being made by something that is made by combustion, like
Yeah.
burning things, like caveman style energy, just like the flame,
Yeah.
caveman. Like, come on, we're in the future. We use crystals,
Yeah.
we use silicon, we do all that stuff. That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about like coal and nuclear, it's like a tea kettle. They're like exploding water and making steam and spinning these things, and all these spinning bearings are going to get worn out and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And things can break and all that. It's just like silicon crystals, folks. That's the way to do it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the idea of drilling into the earth for our energy needs is really barbaric in a way, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, like so I have this plan where like this would actually work is if you wanted to get carbon out of the atmosphere, you make hydrogen, you could turn hydrogen, attach carbon to it, turn it into essentially like a fossil fuel that's made from renewable energy, and then inject it into the ground where we pulled all the oil out.
Yeah, give it back to the earth. Huh?
Yeah, and it's like I guess it would be a lot easier not to have pulled it out in the first place, but hey, who said we wanted to do everything the easy way,
Yeah.
So all we have to do is make up for what us and our recent ancestors from like so many generations have done by pulling that fossil fuel out is to put it back in. And we've
Yeah.
got AI, we've got technology, we could do it. We can make hydrocarbons with solar, with silicon solar cells. We can turn it into hydrogen, turn it into hydrocarbons, and then put it back in those oil wells.
Welcome to the future.
That's my theory, and I'm sure a lot of people think I'm crazy.
I think it's a great idea. Any type of idea that helps capture carbon and giving it back to the earth is a good idea. Although I think Mother Nature has us beat in that aspect. And I like how I'm constantly reading about how countries are actively developing ways to capture more carbon, right? But honestly, Mother Nature already did it with their trees, the number one carbon catching machines out there.
Yeah, the other thing too that I was thinking about is we could take all those trees, turn into like this pulpy wood chip, and we could put that underground too.
Yeah.
Because like one thing about the trees too, though, is like once they decompose, it's like they could be sending the carbon back into the atmosphere. Like if you eat a tree, then you'll like have gas, and that's like methane and stuff like that. So,
Yeah. Fallen trees give way to good mushrooms. So,
yep. And then let's see, those mushrooms get eaten by hippies, and
yeah.
then those hippies breathe out the air, which has got carbon dioxide in it. That's the problem. So that's why we need to just take all those mushrooms, take all those hippies, take all those trees, and take all the fossil fuels, and then put it back underground.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
Just kidding, hippies. We're not going to be doing that for you. And, crazy topics. And I guess the other thing is like rocket ships and stuff like that. It's like they take a lot of fossil fuel and burn in the atmosphere. And I'm sure it's like a net loss as far as carbon goes. But then some of it they take off planet. And then all of a sudden it's not going to be caught in the carbon cycle.
Yeah.
So crazy thoughts, thinking crazy. Always want to have fun
Yeah.
and not get depressed.
Yeah.
So, all right. And just another thing, too, that's kind of weird is in Alaska, my brother's a wildlife biologist in a place called Haines, Alaska, Southeast Alaska. And the glaciers are melting so fast that the sea level is actually going down because the glaciers are melting off the land and the land has less pressure on it and it's rising. And it's like, actually, it's totally happening. And he has beachfront property. And maybe it's something like an inch a year, something like that, maybe a little bit less. But, if he's been there for 25 years or something like that, which he has, it's like we're talking about over a foot of more like mean high tide is that much lower. So it's the opposite of sea level rise. And so if you can't beat them with climate change and global warming and sea level rise, move to Alaska, then you have sea level lowering and things like that. So
That is absolutely fascinating.
yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, beachfront property in Alaska. He's like knows some people where the sea level as the sea level is going down relative to the land, the sea level is still going up, but just the land's going up faster. And they had like a gradual slope, and they've gained like tons of acres because it was just a gradual slope.
That's
And,
incredible.
and so your property line goes up to what they call mean high tide. So
Hey,
crazy. Yep.
yeah. Thank you for teaching me something new today.
Yeah. All right. All right, Paul. So, yeah, and thanks for being here on the podcast. And how do people find you, and how do you like turn them on to buying like all Fronius inverters and nothing else?
Well, I'm not here to just sell Fronius inverters, but if you're looking for a new solar solution and you want some expertise behind it, we're not just a selling company like many and that put profits over people, but we're all about relationships and sustainability. And so if you're looking to have an energy transition into the solar energy world, let's have a talk. You can contact me at my email address. I do have a phone number as well. I do have a LinkedIn, although I don't play too much heavily into social media. But you can contact me at bui.paul@fronius.com, as well as my phone number, which is, I'm sure Sean will put it in the description somewhere, but
Yeah. And so your name is spelled Bui.
yeah,
So you said Bui.paul@fronius.com?
yeah, you got it.
Great. Awesome. Okay. Well, sounds really good, Paul. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. And thank you, everyone else, for listening. And you should sign up for lots of my classes and make sure to get yourself NABCEP certified. There's so much going on with the NABCEP certifications now. In fact, the PVIP, PV Installation Professional Certification, has a new thing called Board Eligible, where people can take the exam without any work experience and still have passed the exam and brag about it that they passed the exam, even though they didn't fulfill the paperwork requirement of showing all their installations. And then once they do fulfill that paperwork requirement, then they can get, the official certification instead of just being considered board eligible. I'm also going to be teaching at the NABCEP conference in March in Reno, Nevada. So everybody should come up there and let's go hang out in Reno. And that'll be a lot of fun. Those conferences are tons of fun. And have a good day, everyone. Woo!